I don't think I've ever said this in an interview before, but like Tom Araya from Slayer, I'm actually Catholic. And so a lot of people are surprised about that, but you're an extreme blackened metal band. Well, it's art, it's freedom of expression. And frankly speaking, in my mind, mainstream Jesus is a cunt. You know, when you've got this Republican Jesus who's fine with guns, you know, shooting up schools and things like that, that Jesus is absolutely a cunt. And I support the freedom of my band to say these things.
Zoe, thank you so much for your time today. We are getting very close now to the release of the Screaming of Valkyries. How are you doing today?
I'm excited. You know, it's 1 week till my first album with Cradle of Filth. I mean, how could you not be excited at this point?
Yeah, I was about to ask you that because, I mean, sure, for the band, and obviously the current lineup have entered that band at different stages, but for the band, this is the 15th or the 16th album, depending on how you count. But you must be pinching yourself because let's just say that you were somewhat of a fan of Cradle before you joined this band as well. So how insane is that feeling? I mean, you've joined the band a few years now. You've been on stage many times. Obviously, you are a full-fledged member of this band, but this is, to your point, that first actual album coming out with your name on it. Excited, I think, doesn't cover it. How are you really feeling?
It's overwhelming. I am pinching myself. You know, besides just being my first album with Cradle of Filth, which is a massive honor, because yes, I did listen to them as a fan beforehand. It also is the first album I've ever made with my husband. Yeah. And that's also crazy, you know, because that's such an intimate act in and of itself to create music with the person that you love. So it's an album with also some of my best friends, not just an album with Cradle of Filth, but an album created with people I respect and enjoy. And that's amazing.
Some bands that have been around as long as Cradle, where new members come into play, quite often they're stuck at that hired gun level, if you will. Not the case for you. You've contributed to this album as well. Was that a surprise when the opportunity to join became a real opportunity in all those conversations, that was part of the job description, that was expected?
I was surprised because originally I thought I was going to be filling in for one tour as a favor. Right. And to be asked to stay on and then to be asked to help write the next album, that was very shocking to me. Right. I'm coming from a very different area of metal. I usually work in symphonic metal with some melodic death metal. So being asked to write for Cradle of Filth and them trusting my compositions was a huge surprise. I didn't think that they would let me do this, if I'm being honest. So
yeah. That's awesome. You shared in other interviews already that at least some members of the band brought in their own kind of like influence of old Cradle back into this sound when writing, and that definitely comes out in this album. This is gonna be an interesting one because it's like, again, depending on how we count, this is the 30th or the 35th anniversary of the band. It's a milestone. Can you follow me when I say that this album really feels a bit like a comeback album of a band that never really was away? But I find that myself and a ton of other people out there, I mean, I grew up in the 90s, right? So for me, I got to know Cradle in the dusk and the Cruelty, times. I find like a lot of older fans are finding their way back to Cradle. I know that a lot of fans never left, don't get me wrong. But does that sound somewhat acceptable to you to say like this really feels like a bit of a comeback?
It does, because, I've said this in other interviews too. Me and the other new kid in the band, Donny Burbage, we both listened also to an older era of Cradle. Right. And so when we came into the band, we brought with us our vision for what the Cradle we grew up with was. And it's really gratifying to hear it from you and from others that they hear that throwback tribute.
Right.
Because we wanted to make an album more like that Cradle sound. Not that there's anything against the last few albums. Hammer
Sure.
of the Witches, Cryptoriana, those are great albums. But me and Donny wanted to do more of a throwback sound, but also with our own kind of newer influences as well. And I think it came across, and I'm really happy a lot of the older fans are hearing more of the Cradle they grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, songs like Malignant, songs like Exsanguine, the single Hellebore as well. They all have like those mid-late 90s feelings that are vibe, I find. So it's cool. Should we then also like look at this as, because a band could just say, hey, this is our 30th or 35th anniversary year, and we're not going to necessarily focus on a bunch of new stuff. We're just going to do greatest hits tours and what have you. Should we look at this album a little bit as a celebration of that milestone?
I would
Given
say
that
yes.
some of those old school influences are there?
I would say, again, when you have 1/3 of the band who grew up listening to Cradle, because Donny and I are also the youngest members, you should definitely hear the tribute to the band's history that I feel we've brought into it. So yeah, I would say this is a celebration of everything Cradle has been, old, new, and also the future.
With a legacy like yours, there is this weird moment that you'll find yourself in more and more, and then you've talked about that in another interview where I think you called out the song non omnis moriar that you really like, and I agree with you. I think it's one of the standout songs on this album, but it might never ever be played live, is I think something that you said, and whether or not that is true for this particular song, with such a long list of songs that this band has, and there are, fortunately or unfortunately, I'll let you be the judge of that, so many classics that are expected that are played at least several times. That when you write and record a new album, a lot of these songs, once they're recorded, that's the end of that song. Unless you go on like, hey, we're going to play the new album from front to back, special tours like that. Is that what's that like for you as an artist, as a creator? Like, is that a very bittersweet feeling?
It can be, but there's also always hope that at some point you're going to dust something off and say, maybe it's time to bring this forward to the live sound. Non omnis moriar is an example. I do hope in the future we end up playing it, because I think lyrically it's also Dani at some of his best work. It's so deep and introspective. Reminds me very much of his lyrics on Discourse Between a Man and His Soul from Existence Is Futile. I really, really love it when he goes in that direction. So I hope we play it live. But bouncing back to the topic of dusting off tracks that haven't been played live before, we're actually debuting a track that was never played live before that is over 20 years old on this upcoming tour. Because Donny and Dougal, primarily, they dusted it off and said, this is an amazing track. It was never played live, and now its time has come. I'm hoping we don't wait 20 years to play some of the songs on Screaming of the Valkyries, but, never say never. Every song, if it has a moment where it's really speaking to us, it has a shot to get played live finally, so...
Behold the golden dawn, our world reborn to a sword.
You mentioned playing with your husband in a band before. Now, people that follow you and your husband on social media, we might forgive them for thinking at first that you do play in a country band versus a dark symphonic or black metal. We could talk about labels another time, but Arizona is home. A state where I've visited Arizona several times.
Where'd you go? Did you go to Phoenix?
I've definitely been to Phoenix for work. I mean, it's almost like if you have to do a conference, Phoenix has a lot of what's the big the Gaylord Conference Center or something like that. I forget right now. That's
not visiting Arizona, by the way. That's like me saying that because I visited Toronto, I've seen Canada. Just saying.
Very good point. So this actually is a great segue, because I have driven through Arizona as well, and other stuff in smaller towns. The first time I went to Arizona was in 1992.
Oh,
put that in perspective.
That's when I made my debut here.
I'm much older than you think.
I'm actually very surprised. So yeah.
but let's call it small town Arizona is definitely, you know, there's heavily community based engagement, often surrounding a church. We obviously know, we were joking before we started recording that, you know, right now we're at war apparently between the US and Canada, but there's definitely people, especially in states like Arizona, that would like to see more of that, you know, conservative community building. Has it become, over the years, easier or harder being part in a state like Arizona, be part of a happily blasphemous, sinful band like Cradle of Filth? That can definitely push some buttons for people, especially people that don't really know the band, right? I mean, I remember in the 90s, people got arrested for wearing a Cradle t-shirt. That's a different extreme, maybe. But what's that like, being both in a band like Cradle and having, you know, a cowboy lifestyle in Arizona?
So the idea of the great American cowboy, you know, the mythology and the romance around it, is the idea of freedom. You know, the open range, the Wild West. And when you celebrate the idea of freedom, it's not much of a massive jump to celebrate the freedom of artistic expression. Mm-hmm. And so heavy metal and the idealistic American cowboy mindset have so much in common, because they are about authenticity. They are about forging your own path forwards. So the two are not really at odds in my mind. And an interesting fact about the state of Arizona is that we have the most independent voters of any state in the United States. And so this state can go either way. In 2020, the state went in a much more progressive direction, which I'm sorry to see that momentum kind of lost at the moment, but it is still here and growing. It's a very artistic state. We have a lot of artist communities in our small towns as well, and artists are always open-minded, and artists want to see you pushing the envelope and being authentic and true to yourself. So I don't really experience a lot of pushback from the folks around me. I mean, another fun fact, I don't think I've ever said this in an interview before, but like Tom Araya from Slayer, I'm actually Catholic. And so a lot of people are surprised about that, but you're an extreme blackened metal band. Well, it's art, it's freedom of expression. And frankly speaking, in my mind, mainstream Jesus is a cunt. You know, when you've got this Republican Jesus who's fine with guns, you know, shooting up schools and things like that, that Jesus is absolutely a cunt. And I support the freedom of my band to say these things.
From the grave on the moonless midnight, sucking up Steve, she was noted for fight.
It's also about taking time to dig a little deeper and not staying on the surface, right? Because I remember from the very early days, I mean, Cradle obviously has gone through a journey, right? Like what started as somewhat of a death metal band has gone in very, very different directions. But, you know, you say like that, you make a reference to a very, very famous artwork, obviously, of Cradle, and I think t-shirts that still sell out everywhere, that are sometimes very hard to get. Cradle has sometimes been accused, I think wrongfully, by people that stay on the surface of like, it's just a band that likes to shock and use sex a lot because sex sells. But if you take that time to dig deeper, from well before you joined the band, there was always like this empowerment message, if you will. Sure, were there seductive people involved in Cradle stories or in Cradle artwork? Yes, but it was often to reclaim something, to take revenge, or to make a statement of empowerment. How important is that part of the message for you, as not only obviously a female, but a mother as well, and somebody that clearly is not afraid to say her mind?
When Dan is writing his lyrics, there is this massive empowerment message behind so much of it. And so much of it is also about the feminine divine and feminine power as well. Definitely you hear that, for example, in Malignant Perfection's lyrics. But also beyond that, I think people need to realize that a lot of what Dan does is very tongue-in-cheek. He's very clever with how he uses words and expressions. And so much of what he's saying is actually kind of a parody, like a satirical statement on things as well, on how he sees the world. And I love that about Dan, because it means that he's not always taking himself so seriously as he's taking the weight of existence seriously, if that makes sense. So
yeah, no, for sure. And another element I think that illustrates all of that is throughout I've seen Cradle live many times. Now, obviously, not trying to discredit that in every scene and every show there can be issues and there's always room for improvement. But I've always felt in a way that I always saw much more women also in the audience with a band like Cradle, and they seemed to feel at least quite safe and welcome, which I could only imagine they would not feel that way if a band was truly, staying where the people that stay on the surface think the band is at. That must be very empowering for you as an artist as well, to see that your band is a band that is still today, tearing down stereotypes in a massive way, creating a welcome space for a lot of people, not just one very specific group of people. Is that something for you that, besides the art itself and creating the music and performing that whole thing that comes around it, the community, if you will, that Cradle has built globally? Like, how top of mind is that for you in the day-to-day?
Well, obviously, being in a place where women feel safe and respected is important for me as a woman. I enjoy the fact that we have so many female fans, because obviously so much of our music goes into like this gothic, romantic element as well. Because again, it's also a celebration of the feminine divine, and I think that resonates with our female listeners. So that is extremely important to me. I especially love it when I see younger girls at our shows, because that was me as a teenager going to metal shows and maybe feeling out of place at a lot of those shows, because the older guys at the shows were like, well, why are you here? This isn't pussy metal. So I don't know if I can say that on your channel, but
you can say whatever the fuck you want, as long as you as a Catholic don't feel bad. If girls are coming to our shows and feeling like they're part of our community, and this is a metal show where they're welcome, that's a great thing. And I wish that the rest of the metal community would stop being such gatekeepers sometimes, because if a girl wants to come out to a metal show, if she wants to come see, Slayer, Creator, why are we pushing them away? Why are we telling them they don't belong here? They belong here. I belonged there as a teenager. They belong there too. We'll see I'm sure many women at the shows for this insane tour that's coming. And it's genuinely insane. This is just a traveling festival at this point. You're playing throughout North America with Dying Fetus and Neobliviscaris, Flesh God, and there's a couple of other ones I forget right now. I think there's 7 bands on the bill. That I can only imagine how chaotic that tour will go behind the scenes sometimes. But you're playing in Toronto May 7th. I can't wait for that show, obviously. But on this tour, what can we expect? Again, you've got a whole new album to celebrate. You also have an insane amount of songs that people want to hear. A lot of people will see you maybe for the first time as well, and they will have their specific requests. And then there's 7 bands, so it's not that you can play 2-hour shows. So what can we expect from this tour?
You're going to expect a really tight list. We can only play for an hour, obviously, with as many bands on the bill. But it's going to be some of our heaviest, most fun, face-melting material. Like I said, we are debuting a track that's over 20 years old, that's never been played live, at the request of Donny and Dougal, our bassist. He's Daniel Firth, we call him Dougal. And I think people especially are going to go crazy when they hear the live debut of this older song, because it's such a banger. I love this song. I'm so glad the guys brought it up, because it's just an absolute face melter, and I have no idea why we never played it before.
Yeah.
And
All right.
And of course, you can expect to hear some stuff off of Screaming of the Valkyries too. We'll have the new stuff as well.
I mean, talking from one fan to another fan, that obviously you're much more than that. But one thing that Cradle also set the bar for in the late 90s was, in the late 90s, we had all these cool EPs as well that came out. And I kind of went away a little bit as digital took over. But the bar was set with the From the Cradle to the Enslaved EP. That for me is still like the EP of the 90s, if you will. If there was one song, because that EP obviously had a couple of different, couple of songs, a couple of cover songs. I think there was a Misfits cover song on that album as well, but then also some cool remixes and versions that was very 90s. If there was one song on this album that you feel like, oh, we could do so much more with this and different crazy ideas, and nobody would say no to you, like all your wild ideas could come to reality. Is there one song on this album that you would love to give that EP treatment?
You mean like from Screaming of the Valkyries, like a particular song that could get like a whole new kind of...
Yeah.
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, I would say that my answer for that would be When Misery Was a Stranger, which is the closing track on the album. I love that song. I hope we play it live, but there also are some alternative directions it could have been taken in that it didn't go there. I think we're all very happy with how it turned out in the end, but definitely there would be room to explore it more. So it's a great track.
Yeah. I love that you picked that one, because for me, when I was listening to the album, for me, it almost feels like, and maybe I'm seeing ghosts here, but it almost feels like the album kind of wraps up with, I think it's Ex Sanguine Dracula is the song before that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like the album kind of wraps up with that, and then that song is kind of like setting the stage more for, I feel like it's the start of something, and I feel like I'm not sure where it's going to take us, but is there some truth to that? Like is that song does that give us an idea of what's coming next for Cradle? Because I have a feeling it's also not going to be too long before we get new stuff.
You know, I can't speak lyrically for Dan where he's going, because his subtle themes and ideas that run throughout albums are kind of his to explore. But I will say, in the musical direction of that song, you can expect, I think, a lot more of the same coming up, because it's the same team and the same process, because we're actually already working on the follow-up album. I'm sure you've seen Dan mention that. So you're going to be hearing some continuation of Screaming of the Valkyries. We're going to push the envelope, I think, even further in some directions. I can't give away too much more because it's so early, but let's see what happens. All
right. Awesome. You say enough to make us all super excited, and, cross our fingers for Zoe. Thank you so much for your time. I know how insanely busy these promo weeks are for a band like Cradle, so I very much appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions as you're also preparing for this insane tour and already working on the next album, all the kind of good stuff, and being a mom on top of all of that. I can't wait to see you and the whole band and all the other bands in Toronto in May, and excited for all the fans to find out all the details of this new album once it's out next week.
That's coming up so fast. And thank you, by the way, because that was a really interesting, fun interview, and I love those. So.
Oh, well, my pleasure. My pleasure.
You are awesome for watching this video. Click right here to see more content like it and subscribe to the channel.